have the crankshaft out of the Riley engine again, and I think I've figured out what's going on now and what I'm supposed to do. I'm just still deciding the best way to do it. So you might remember from before that at the rear of the crankshaft here, inside here, there's quite a big radius on this modern crank. So I did have to relieve the bush there so that the crank would actually go far enough into the block so that the front cover would go on. I've done that. That all works now. The next problem was trying to figure out how you set up the end float, and that's all done on this front bush. So this is the cover that fits onto the front of the engine like that, and that's what sits down over the front of the crankshaft. So this face here pushes up against that bush. It doesn't actually touch it. We'll get to that in a sec, but the end float is set, I believe, between this front face and this thrust washer. So this washer goes on there, and then when the gear is on there and the nut is on there, that pushes that thrust washer hard up against that shoulder. And then it sits on there and it sort of rubs on that face there. What I was finding with mine is with the crankshaft in the block, I had about 10 thou movement forwards and backwards on the crankshaft. And I had to draw this little diagram to figure it out for myself. So this hashed thing is this bush here, and the rest of it is the crankshaft. So with the crankshaft pushed all the way back, I had 10 thou movement, so I could move it forwards and backwards 10 thou. When I pulled it all the way forwards, the crankshaft was more or less level with the front of the bush here. And it should be coming through, it should be protruding a bit, because otherwise what happens is you put the thrust washer on, and if there's no clearance there, that just locks everything solid, and that's what was happening. So with this in place and the gear, or rather my gear substitute, and the nut on the end, the crankshaft wouldn't turn, and it's because it was missing this clearance here. What you're supposed to have, according to the manuals, is 2 thou of clearance, which would look like that. So that means this part of the crankshaft has to be 2 thou higher than the front of this bush, so that when the thrust washer goes on, you've got that 2 thou clearance. The crank can move backwards and forwards 2 thou. I already know it can go back 10 thou, so there's plenty of clearance in that direction. To confirm all of this, I stopped messing around with rulers and feeler gauges, and actually got the indicator out. So I confirmed that 10 thou forwards and backwards, and I ordered some of these shims. So these are 6 thou shims, which are a perfect fit, luckily, for the front of the crankshaft. So when I assembled the engine with the 6 thou shim there, and using the DTI on the end of the crank here, moved it backwards and forwards, I found I have 5.5 to 6 thou end float then, which is what you would expect if this was coming forward and being practically flush with the front of the bush. So if you imagine with that shim in there, then when I measure the end float, because the thrust washer is now 6 thou out, it can move back that 6 thou, and that was giving me my 6 thou clearance. The manual states you should aim for 2 thou. Another figure I've been given is 3 to 5. 6 is probably okay as well. So I think that would actually be a solution I could run with that. But the proper way would be to take some off here, but there's no way I can machine this in my vise. It just won't, in my lathe, sorry, it just won't fit. It's too big. And I wouldn't trust myself trying to cut that on the mill. I'm not that good a machinist. But what I was wondering is, could you take 2 thou off the white metal here, which will allow the crank to go forwards further? Now, the Riley engine's a bit weird. So my understanding is when the engine's running, there isn't any appreciable forwards and backwards thrust on either this face or the other face of the bearing. The thrust all usually comes on when you engage the clutch. And in a normal car, like the MG say, when you push on the clutch, you're pushing forwards on it, and it's a bit hard to explain, but it basically, the force as you're pushing down on the clutch pushes the crankshaft forwards, which if that was the case for this engine, it would mean this face would be rubbing on here when you put your foot on the clutch. But because this is an original Riley clutch, it's a little bit different. So this goes on the back of the flywheel. There's usually the springs in there, which is what keeps this all separated. And there's a bearing that goes on here and a metal cup that fits on here. And when you engage the clutch on this one, you're actually pulling this back. So my understanding of it is that this is actually upside down. You have to imagine this is on the inside. This is the cover that goes over the flywheel. So the springs are usually flattening all this down. So it's compressing the friction plate. So normally when you engage the clutch on the Riley, this pulls backwards. So that's going to pull against those springs, normally inside there, which is going to pull the flywheel the opposite way, I think. Which means there shouldn't ever be much thrust on this. It's all taken up on that the front one, which is this. So if that's the case, can I not just take 2 thou carefully off the back of this to give me the clearance I need and give me the inflow? So there is at least 13 thou thickness of white metal there. Like I say, I'm not that good a machinist to be able to do that, but I think I could probably carefully flatten that down with a piece of fine wet and dry on a piece of glass. It may take a little while, but probably not, because this white metal is really soft. And I think that might actually do the trick. I need to think about that a bit and see if that is actually a solution, but I think that would work. The reason I can get away with doing that is because that isn't ever really used as a thrust face. So even if I don't get it perfectly flat, I don't think it's going to matter. So the other thing I've been looking at is how far down the flywheel is fitting on the taper. So it didn't seem like it was going down quite far enough. Someone in the comments really helpfully left me a number, which was about 72 millimeters between here and here, I think, if I'm understanding the comment correctly. When I measure mine, it's about 73.8. It's a bit hard to measure it exactly. 73.8, no, yes, 73.8, 74, so about 2 millimeters difference. And I'm not sure if that's enough to make a difference to it all. I don't think I can do it with one hand. I'll just pause this for a sec. Right, it's quite heavy. With the nut done up, you can see the nut isn't going flush. But there's also a bearing that fits in there, which is over here. This is the little, the bearing that the input shaft of the gearbox fits into. And there's definitely plenty of room for that in there. Oh, I don't want to push it all the way in because it'll probably get stuck. But, yeah, I don't know if that's enough of a difference to matter. And I think the thing is, I'm not going to be able to tell until I do a test assembly of it all and try and bolt the gearbox and the clutch on and see if they will still actually work the way they're supposed to. Otherwise, what I'm going to need to do is have the flywheel taper remachined so that this will go the extra 2 millimeters down. Is 2 millimeters enough to really make a difference there? Very hard to know. So the other thing I've been looking at is I've cleaned up the cam gears. I think I'm going to need to get new bearings. These seem a little bit pitted. It's always hard to tell if I can reuse things or not. But on this one, I have a little bit of a problem, which is that clearance in there. So again, I'm not sure the best way to fix that. When this is all together and it's running, I don't know how much thrust there is on either of these. Can I just get away with a washer inside there? Yeah, just another strange thing to look at. The other thing I'm not sure about is normally, supposedly, Riley cams, the real ones, the exhaust cam, is supposed to have little marks. I believe on here, the fourth lobe, there's meant to be a little dot or a cross or something, but I haven't seen that on these. So I'm not sure what these camshafts are or what the grind on them is. So that's something else I have to figure out. I may actually set this up in the lathe just so I can hold it between centers and make up a degree wheel on it, and actually I want to actually check and see what the cam timing is on this, just because these look like they've been reground and I'm not sure what they've been set to. So because there's two camshafts, there's only 4 lobes on each one. I think a cat just jumped on the roof. But the other interesting thing about the Riley 9 engine is you've got this special cam in the middle, which you can see has 4 lobes. And inside the head, there's what's called lag tappets, which is just a kind of like a dummy tappet that sits on there, and there's a spring behind it. So when the head goes on, it's pressing on this continually. And apparently the idea behind that is because you've only got 4 lobes on this cam, it's quite sort of lumpy as the camshaft turns and it's pushing the valves up and down. And this extra lag tappet in the middle sort of helps to even out some of that unevenness on the forces on the camshaft, apparently. I think some people say they leave them out. Other people say you have to put them in. I've got them, so I'll probably just put them in. But yeah, it's one of those interesting little things about these vintage engines. So I'm not going to do anything tonight. I'm going to think about it a bit more. I can't remember, but I painted up the hubs, and I may look at fixing I've got the paint now just to touch up the wheels where the paint was damaged. And tomorrow I will look at Loctiting and tapping with a hammer these rear shackles home, and then figure out how I'm going to cross drill and rivet those in place. I think that's it. Also, I did remember that I've got an engine crane or an engine stand, so at some point I should put that on there, but I haven't so far because, of course, when you've got the block on the engine stand, you can't get the flywheel on and off, which I need to do at the moment. So I think the next thing to do will be figure out what I'm going to do with the end float, which is either use the shim and end up with 6 thou end float, which may be too much, or carefully flatten this down 2 thou, which will give me the 2 thou end float, which is as per the book. I don't believe it's going to make any difference to where the rods sit. We're talking, fractions of an inch, and they're floating at the top end anyway. So if they're slightly off center, I don't think it matters. I'm not really sure. So Yeah, this is the tricky one. If this taper needs to be opened up a bit, I have to go back to an engineer to do that. There's no way I can do that myself. So more things to think about.